I want to talk about these anti-government protests here in Thailand and their planned protest at the Crown Property Bureau building in Bangkok. Now, they weren't able to go ahead with that protest because the Thai government took very extensive measures to prevent the protesters from getting anywhere near that building. And what the Thai government did was they took these steel shipping containers and stacked them up on top of each other with razor wire along the bottom, making it virtually impossible for the protesters to get around. Now, why did the Thai government think that that was necessary to do? Because the protesters, the Western media, the opposition media here in Thailand, and even these, human rights groups like Human Rights Watch, all complained about these barriers being erected. But just think back to the last protest at the Royal Thai Police headquarters in downtown Bangkok. The protest leaders had the protesters surround the headquarters, destroy the gates and the walls, and they were throwing garbage and objects and paint over the walls at the police, endangering their safety and well-being. And the protest leaders instigating this violence and vandalism had no idea whether or not the police would crack down in response. Had the police cracked down, the protesters themselves might have been endangered. So the government knows that the protesters have already used violence and vandalism, and they felt that any future protest, this might also be a possibility. They have to take every step possible to avoid this from happening. And the protesters themselves have even complained that the police didn't do enough to avoid violence. Remember when they blocked the Queen's car, they said, why didn't the police do more to keep the protesters and the Queen's car apart? When the yellow shirts and the protesters clashed outside Parliament, they complained that the police didn't do enough. So now here the police and the government put up these barriers and they complain that that's too much. So we really see just how unreasonable the protesters are. And they didn't just lash out against the government. They also started lashing out at the companies whose names were on these shipping containers. One of them, Maersk, was just swarmed online by these protesters. And you have to think about what this actually is. These are protesters that are angry that there were barriers in their way from going to another building that they wanted to destroy. And, security personnel whose job it was to guard that building, who they wanted to fight with. And they're complaining that they weren't able to do this because of, they're blaming Maersk for giving their container to the Thai government, which Maersk most certainly didn't do. Worse still is groups like Human Rights Watch complaining to Maersk. And this is Phil Robertson. He's the Deputy Asia Director of Human Rights Watch. And he says on social media, Maersk, how do you feel about the Thailand authorities using your shipping containers as crowd control barriers? Did you consent to this? And of course, Maersk didn't consent to this. They had nothing to do with this, except that their name was just so happened to be on these shipping containers that through third parties made their way to the Thai government. Someone actually pointed that out because that was an official statement Maersk made. Phil Robertson responds by saying, so what? They don't care when their company logo is associated with human rights abuses and repression? Someone needs to explain how creating a barrier to prevent a violent mob from reaching a building and destroying it and fighting with the security personnel whose job it is to protect that building, how stopping that from happening is somehow a human rights abuse. Is it a human right to destroy somebody else's property and to fight with security personnel who are trying to guard that property? And how is that a form of repression? And of course, it's not. It isn't in any shape, form, or way. This is Phil Robertson trying to pressure an international company to make a statement that is damaging to the Thai government, because that's what people like Phil Robertson do. They hide behind human rights to advance a political agenda. When the US government is backing anti-government protests, like they are doing right now in Thailand, they use organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International to use the smokescreen of human rights to protect them, to cover up the abuses that they're carrying out, and to make any measure at all taken against the protesters, no matter how lawful or reasonable it is, like just building a barrier so they can't destroy a building. They tried to twist that into a human rights abuse or a form of repression. We just saw Phil Robertson do that right here. So I just want Thai people to be aware of that. I want international audiences to be aware of that. This is what Human Rights Watch is doing in Thailand right now. So please raise awareness about this. Don't let them get away with this, and don't let these protesters and these fake rights advocate groups pressure companies like Maersk, who didn't do anything wrong in this case. And just think about the damage that these Thai protesters and their foreign backers are doing to Thailand's image right now when they do things like this. So if you thought the video was useful, please like and share it. If you subscribe to my channel, it really helps it grow, and I really appreciate that. And as always, thank you very much for watching.